Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is The Wild Cab Ride of Maniac. Escaped lunatic, run away with a locomotive. The subheadline is Orders were to ditch the engine at Fairview, but this was not necessary. Search for the poor fugitive, and alas the mystery of his disappearance solved. It says, not long ago, I took dinner with a New Jersey man, about 55 years of age, who had been in the railroad service 40 years, to attain at last a high position, though he began at the bottom of the ladder when he got his first job, then a boy of 15 years old. He is a stout-built man, with a strong weather-beaten face, gray hair and whiskers, individualized by a firm expressive mouth, and lit up by shrewd, kindly gray eyes. My friend is not much of a talker, being a man who does things, like Mark Twain's Mr. Likens of California. But I got something out of him before we had finished the postprandial cigar. You must have had some thrilling experience in your long railroad career, Mr. Blank, I began tentatively. A man who has worked on and along the line as long as you have, coming in contact with thousands of people on the great highways of travel, cannot fail to have seen and heard and been a part of much that would be worth telling. Well, I don't know, said Mr. Blank, in the full enjoyment of his after-dinner smoke. My life has been full of hard work and some hard knocks, but they did not come by being telescoped in rear-end or head-on collision. I was never dumped through a drawbridge or tumbled into a culvert or holocausted in a wreck. In fact, he said, I haven't any of the material for a hero of what you newspaper men call a story. And yet, I don't know, he went on, meditatively and slowly. I did once pass a mightily exciting hour or two on the railroad, and I do not mind giving you the facts as I recall them. And here follows the railroad man's strange story. I had worked down at the very mudsills of railroad employment for about 5 years, when at the age of 20, I got my first promotion in the shops of a position as station agent at Holly Springs, which included also that of telegraph operator, for I had managed to make myself a fair manipulator of the instrument by spending all my spare time and money at a night school. Holly Springs was just midway between the hustling city and the flourishing manufacturing town of Fairview, 22 miles from each. There was a small village of 2 or 3 country stores and a few dwellings clustered about the station. But the chief life and stir at that point grew out of the fact that it was a meeting place for night freights and passenger trains. I had ample time during the day to play quoits with the villagers at the end of the platform, or read a New York paper obtained now and then from the news butcher. But from supper time until nearly midnight, I had to hustle, with my hands full of work and my head full of responsibility. One night, in the latter part of April, with a fog settling down in the hollows and wrapping itself around the hills, while the lamps along the railroad shed burned blurred and dim, the last train had gone on until the through mail at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was looking around to see that everything was all right, preparing to turn in on my bunk in the little room adjoining the office, when a sharp peremptory click at the telegraph instrument carried me to the table with a jump. And this was the startling message from the operator at the city. Runaway locomotive on track, let pass, have telegraphed Fairview to ditch at crossing. Runaway trains or locomotives are of course rare spectacles on a railroad track, but they are troubles within the experience of nearly all railroad men. For all that, the engineer, in leaving his post, may accidentally touch the lever with his foot. He may fall from his cab in a fit, or be taken suddenly ill. Anyhow, here was the city warning Holly Springs to look out for a runaway locomotive. I was right smart brought up when I jumped out on the platform and ran down the line to be sure that the switches were straight and the track clear. Allowing for 2 or 3 minutes to size up the situation at the city, and 2 or 3 more to inform the operator and flash the message on, I calculated that the runaway locomotive was making a mile-a-minute run to the goal of its ditch at Fairview, and that a few minutes would bring it down on me like a whirlwind. And here it came. First there was a far-off, subdued rumble, then an earthquake tremble under the platform, then a hoarse roar, a lurid red glare through the fog, like the angry eye of a wild beast, A rush of wheels, a tempest of wind, and sparks and smoke, and my God, the engine dashed by the long warehouse with a man in the cab. 'Twas but an instant, but I saw him plainly, bareheaded, face white and cadaverous, hair flying in the wind, a long brown coat about his tall, thin form. What in the world did it mean? Up and down the platform I ran distractedly. Here was a human being, rushing to his death in the ditch at Fairview. Then I sprang to the instrument, called the latter place, and it seemed to me I almost made the keys yell in agony. Man on runaway engine, don't ditch, for God's sake. That was all I could do, and when I sat down in the office to draw breath, I was utterly unnerved with the horror of the thing. Then I looked up at the clock. The midnight rider was nearly at his doom. The minutes flew by, and then click, click, click from Fairview. What's the matter with you fellows at Holly Springs in the city anyhow? No runaway locomotive has turned up down this way. It was a blessed relief, and with it an idea flashed into my mind. The mysterious driver had stopped his iron horse, or he had been wrecked somewhere on the track, and the through mail was coming with early morning. I ran to the section master's house, woke him up, and gave him a hurried explanation, and in a few moments we were running down the line on a handcar. At the distance of about 10 miles, we came upon the engine standing on the track, panting as if wearied by its wild jaunt over gloom-clad hill and dale, but deserted. Where was the bare-headed, pale-faced man in the brown coat? There was no life there, but the throb of the heart of that great mass of mechanism. "What's that?" cried the section master, and looking down the track, I saw, miles away, another great blinking, fiery eye, plunging out of the darkness. Another locomotive? No, but an engine and tender from the city, bringing the train dispatcher and two official-looking personages whose mission was soon explained. The locomotive had been run away with a lunatic escaped from the state asylum, who, it was afterwards ascertained, had been seen lurking around the yard at the city, and had seized his opportunity. He had been tracked by the officers in search of him, and a woman on the highway had told of giving a poor tramp an old cast-off long brown coat, as much to rid of him as in charity, for he was a wild-looking fellow, and she was afraid of him. And now began the search for the poor fugitive. The light of the lanterns plainly showed where he had leaped into the soft soil of the ditch from the cab, where he had clambered up the opposite bank and made his way across a field of young corn. The trail was never lost, even to the verge of a dense swamp, and the men plunged, all the next day and the next. It was surrounded and ransacked, but the jungle held its prey, and no one came upon a trace of the distraught wanderer. "Poor creature," said one of the officers of the asylum. "He is lying in there dead, doubtless. He was weak and ailing, and subject to heart disease." "That's a first-rate story," said I. "Is that all?" "Well, no," replied Mr. Blank, carefully flipping the ash from his cigar into the little bronze dish on the table. "The strangest part of it is to come." A short time after these exciting occurrences, I was promoted to a more responsible post with the same railroad company, about 100 miles distant, and as I had become acquainted with that section and had acquired a kindly feeling for the people, I subscribed for the Fairview Era. One day, about 5 years later, when I opened my Era, just come in on the mail, I read a remarkable story to the effect that John Watkins, a farmer living between Holly Springs and Fairview, was out hunting a lot of his hogs, which had run wild in the swamp. Making his way with great difficulty down into the bayou, he climbed the slanting trunk of a large water oak that he might look over the surrounding bay trees and gallberry bushes and survey the situation. Watkins nearly fell backward to the ground in sheer terror, for there, half standing, half sitting in the hollow of the great decayed tree, the grinning face close to his, was the skeleton of a man. At the tree were the frayed remnants of an old brown coat, and scattered here and there the stamped buttons worn in the clothing of the inmates of the asylum. At last, the mystery of the maniac's wild midnight ride was revealed, poor wretch. Fleeing from pursuit, his benighted mind wrought to a pitch of frenzy as steam and steel whirled him on through the hours of the night. the cunning of the mad man driving him from the open to the solitude of forest and swamps. Wearied out with the frantic efforts of the night, the bruised heart carried him to the shelter of the oak and then stopped. The elements sported with him, and the birds of the air circled about him, but God had already taken him home. As Mr. Blank and I walked out of the dining room, the waiter, whose eyes were the size of saucers, heaved a big sigh and began piling up the dishes. I was not the only auditor. This article was written by J.H.M. from Fayetteville on April 25th. This story came from the great state of North Carolina, being reported in the Wilmington Messenger of May 4th, 1906. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.